Okay, good evening, everyone. We have quite a group for a, hot summer night. Thank you for joining us. And tonight is the first week on a 4-part series on Bach, presented by Gil Harel. And tonight is the early years, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
All right, okay, because I'm not going into Bach, he's going to do that. But first, I just want to take a few minutes to thank you for your continuing support for the library, support in every way, and we thank you very much. If you'll just turn off your cell phones and anything else that might be disturbing to Gil and your neighbor. Dr. Harel is a musicologist, earning his PhD from Brandeis University, presently teaching at Naugatuck Community College, where he, listen to this, conducts the college chorale a cappella ensemble, teaching and serving as musical director of theater production. Not a wonder that he was presented with the Merit Award for exemplary service to the college, while still finding time to be with his wife and baby daughter. Is baby still baby?
Baby's 6 months old.
Oh, okay. Well, congratulations.
See her. She'll be here next week, I think.
All right, great. Here we are. Voila.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Indeed, thank you to Jane. Thank you to the library. Thank you, of course, to everyone who's here on, as Jane pointed out, what is a very hot, sultry night in July. We'll be meeting on every consecutive Tuesday in July from here until the end of the month. So I hope you'll stick around, and in fact, I am sure that if you do, you'll not regret it. I'd like to start, as I am wont to do, by sharing an anecdote. And this one's going to take us back, not quite to the 18th century, not yet. We'll get there momentarily, but this one will take us back to the year 2005. Where I was an undergraduate, about 20 years old, walking the halls of Schlossberg Auditorium, where I would constantly seek out a practice room so I could hone my skills as a pianist. And I was known back then for walking around with a pile of scores under my arm. Now I just carry an iPad. Much more efficient. But of course, in 2005, I would have my scores with me, and I would make sure that these trips to the practice rooms would be time well spent, and that I would have a great spectrum of repertoire, which I could use to hone my understanding of different eras, be it Baroque, classical, romantic, impressionist, modern, jazz, whatever it was. And on this particular occasion, I had not just any score on top, but a score that I still use all the time to this day, for reasons I'll discuss later in this lecture series. It was 371 Bach chorales. On the surface, these chorales don't seem to be anything monumental. This is not something on the virtuosic level of the Beethoven Hammerklavier Sonata. This is not something as groundbreaking in its sound as even some of Beethoven's earlier sonatas, be they titled Waldstein or Appassionata. This is not something, a tour de force, for example, that Bach wrote in the 1740s, known as the Goldberg Variations, which we'll get to at the end of this lecture series. In fact, one could look at this score of the 371 harmonized Bach chorales, and it might go right over your head. You might just see the word Bach, and that's all you take away. But as I said, this was not just any occasion. This was a special occasion. And it was special because of all the people to run into on that particular day. I ran into a man named Yehudi Weiner, who incidentally would win the Pulitzer Prize in Music the following year. Not bad. He was on the faculty, and this was, as a matter of fact, his last year as a faculty member. He had turned 80 that year, and you know the old adage about professors never wanting to quit because we love our job too much, I guess. Well, Yehudi was 80, and he had decided that this was going to be his twilight year, and he was going to ride off into the sunset to focus more on composition and fishing and whatever else he was interested in pursuing. I know he was interested in fishing because some of my classmates felt that he had sort of checked out of our lessons where he was teaching us music theory that semester. He would come into class, often late, saunter in a sort of casual way and begin to talk about things like his neighbor's cat, the renovations on his garage, his latest fishing trip, etc. And I could tell that this would drive my classmates bananas, because here they were, and to be quite candid, many of them were serial overachievers who had their notes out and were ready to write down every iota, every scintilla of wisdom espoused by this venerated musician and great pedagogue, from what we had all heard. And yet, what did this great pedagogue talk about? Fishing trips, garage renovations, and of course, that damn neighbor's cat. When he did talk about music, it was spellbinding. No surprise there. And yet he talked about music rather infrequently for someone who was, go figure, paid to talk about music. I ran into Yehudi in the hallways, and this was probably about midterms. So I'd been in his class for at least 6 weeks, perhaps closer to 2 months. And he looked at me and squinted suspiciously and said, "I know you." And I said, "Yes, Professor Weiner, I'm in your class every Monday and Wednesday, 9 a.m. And he said, "Yeah, Gary." I said, "Gil." He said, "Yeah, that's it. What do you have there?" He seemed interested in the pile of scores. And I said, "Well, sir, I've got some Debussy, and I've got some Mozart, and I've got some Rachmaninoff, and I've got some Bach." And he said, "Some Bach, huh? Let me take a look." And he looked, and he picked up score as if he was touching a holy relic. And he said, "This isn't a score." And I said, "It's not, sir?" And he looked at me and he said, "No. That right there is the Bible." I didn't really understand it at the time, but as I would go on to eventually write a dissertation on the music of J.S. Bach, I began to wrap my head around this enigmatic line that was uttered by this venerated musician in New York. Let me suggest, as I often do at the beginning of a lecture series, it's going to be quite difficult to discuss everything that we're going to want to discuss over the next 4 Tuesdays. Some of you are familiar with the Bach work catalog, what's known in German as the Bach Werkverzeichnis, or simply the BWV catalog. And you'll know, if you're familiar with that catalog, that there are over 1,000 numbers, catalog works, in the BWV catalog. And clearly we will not have time to talk about 1,000 works. We could all live to be as old as Methuselah, and we would still not have time to talk about everything that Bach composed. So what I've chosen to do instead is to focus on a few genres, week by week. And we're going to start this week by talking about 2 genres that are quite different. One instrumental, one vocal. The instrumental genre is what we're going to focus on at the beginning of the program, and that is the organ fugue, the organ as an instrument in general, because I think many people are familiar with the organ. Perhaps you've seen one, maybe you've heard one. But how many people know how an organ actually works, or furthermore, how an organ worked 300 years ago? Well, that's a bit of a bugbear, even for seasoned musicians to figure out. So we'll talk a little bit about the organ, which was Bach's Hauptinstrument, as they would have said, or his main instrument. In the second half of the program, we're going to focus on a genre that singers will perhaps be familiar with. And even if you're not a singer, you could probably figure out that it has something to do with singing, because this genre, Bach was very prolific in this genre. He wrote over 200 of these pieces that survived. They're known as cantatas. Of course, cantata has that Latin root which suggests something which is sung. As opposed, by the way, to a toccata, which comes from the word meaning to touch, as in the English word tactile. And that would refer more to instrumental piece, and specifically with Bach, a type of organ prelude. I want to go back to 1723. Bach, at this point, is now established, and I think for most people who know anything about music in Europe, not just established, but someone who is highly esteemed in musical circles. He was known as a great organist, And at this point, he's starting to get a reputation as a great composer. He arrives in the city of Leipzig, where he would spend the last 27 years of his life for an audition. And this particular audition was for one of the highest positions that musicians could attain back in the Baroque period, one of the most sought-after roles, or as musicians like to say, gigs, in town, and this is what we now call the Kapellmeister, sort of sound like chapel master. And what it suggests is that Bach would, if he got the job, he would have been the boss, or the main composer, director, sort of the musical director of what was going on in the town of Leipzig at the Thomaskirche at the St. Thomas Church. And in fact, he did get the job. But would it surprise you to learn that when the council convened to choose from all the applicants and candidates who had auditioned for this job, Bach was not first on the list. He was not second on the list. Nor was he third on the list. I believe he was fifth on the list. And yet every other candidate, when they were offered the gig, said something like, well, you know what, I've decided to take this job in Hamburg instead. Or, you know what, I know that salary we discussed pretty good, but actually how do you feel about coming up a little bit? And so finally the council chooses Bach. And there's a very infamous quote that's recorded in the minutes of that meeting. And the quote goes something like this: well, gentlemen, in the absence of better men, it seems we must settle for Herr Bach. Now, I've told you a little bit about how Bach is perceived now, with that anecdote from Yehudi Weiner about this being the Bible. In other words, this is the source, what the Germans call the Ursprung of musical knowledge, can be contained in one book, 371 harmonized Bach chorales. And we've now established an antipode to that perception, have we not? With this quote from the St. Thomas Church Ecclesiastical Council that chose Bach, but only grudgingly, and thinking that they were getting sort of fifth-rate composer. Well, how do we square those two perceptions? I think it's a really good question that we want to entertain, not just tonight, but throughout the duration of this lecture series. How did Bach go from being a dismissed, underappreciated, undervalued, humble, provincial composer out in the boonies, if you will, in Leipzig, which back then had a population of something like 4,000. Nowadays, Leipzig has a population closer to 1 million. I think it's about 800,000. How did he go from fifth on the list for a job at a provincial church to being considered by many to be the greatest? I don't like to use superlatives, but I think enough people use this kind of language, so we can put it in scare quotes at least. The greatest, the best, the source, the Bible writer, the ultimate teacher for those who want to learn music. Let me tell you, by the way, as a footnote to this discussion, that when you study music theory, well, guess who you study? You don't study Mozart, at least not at first, and you certainly don't study Beethoven or Schubert, not at first. When you want to learn the rules of composition, when you want to learn how notes fit together simultaneously and both in a vertical and horizontal configuration, which is to say both harmony and counterpoint and things we're going to discuss, you study Bach. This was the case for me when I was an undergraduate, and I'm proud to say it's the case at Naugatuck Valley Community College when I teach music theory. The students say, what textbook are you using, professor? All that's in the syllabus is something about this 371 harmonized Bach chorales. And of course, the feedback at the end of the semester and at the end of the music theory run is often something like, I'm really glad we didn't have a textbook to read short examples out of, and that's often what you get in music theory textbooks, many of which are great, very helpful. But to truly understand the rules of counterpoint and harmony, it would be tough to find a better teacher than J.S. Bach. So now I feel like we know something about this Bach guy. And if we can get those track lights in the back, might be able to see a picture of him here. Well, he's not about to be on the cover of GQ or anything like that. But here he is as an elder statesman. He's close to his 60th birthday here. And this one was painted by a guy named Elias Gottlieb Hausmann. And it shows Bach in the typical garb of a mid-18th century composer, really a mid-18th century man. He's wearing his powdered wig. And if you look closely, you can see he's holding a score. I believe the score in this particular painting was the Goldberg Variations, which I alluded to earlier and which we'll talk about when we get to it. That's going to be our next lecture series. It's called Into the Enlightenment. All right. I think we should set some goals. With any lecture, with any learning experience, it really helps to have a tangible sense of what we can expect ourselves to gain in that, however long it is, in the hour that we're here together on Tuesday evenings. So let me establish a few pedagogical goals for tonight. Some things which I think will be helpful for us to take away so that if somebody asked you at the end of the evening, what did you learn over in Darien? Well, you would be able to talk about all sorts of things, including my old professor's antipathy towards his neighbor's cat, but also, more importantly, how music in the Baroque period worked, what it sounds like, and two specific genres in the organ repertoire, organ fugues, and the church cantata, be able to talk about those as well and say a few things about some specific works. Okay. A few minutes about Baroque music. We can talk for eons, it seems, about musical style. That's one of my favorite things to talk about. Why a particular style of music sounds the way it does. What makes Bach sound different from Mozart or Beethoven or any of the other composers in the textbook, so to speak. Well, music in the Baroque period, to understand it, we can think about art in the Baroque period. Before Bach, Bach was born in 1685, so we can go back to the 17th century and talk about some examples of art from this period. Now, next week I'll talk more about this, but for now let's think of one example which we can all conjure up in the mind's eye, and that would be the Palace of Versailles, or as a student of mine once said, the Palace of Versailles. I asked the student, I said, and do you know who lived at the Palace of Versailles? And he said, yeah, sure, that's easy. It was King Louis. He wasn't wrong, I guess. Those of you who have visited Versailles, or perhaps seen pictures, or there's a Netflix series called, go figure, Versailles, you'll know that Versailles is one of the quintessential examples of Baroque architecture, which is to say, it has the hallmark traits of Baroque architecture in that it is sort of over the top in its level of detail, in its ostentatiousness, its gaudiness, its level of scope and detail. For example, imagine a room, imagine this room. Now, instead of having a very basic style in the wood paneling and the paint on the walls, imagine having marble and alabaster and intricately carved wall sconces and angels and cherubs and mythological figures so that you can put your candles there. And imagine you looked up at the ceiling and you saw also elaborate paintings. And imagine you looked at the chandeliers, which were colossal in scope. Every aspect of every crystal glittering in the candlelight. This is sort of Baroque artistic style in a nutshell. Very ornate, very embellished, very detailed. A later generation would say, perhaps, very busy. That is to say, there's a lot going on in Baroque art. And we see similar things happening in paintings of the time. One of my favorite paintings from this period is by a painter named Artemisia Gentileschi. Some of you may be familiar with those. We'll look at some of them next week. And one of these particular works is called Judith Beheading Holofernes. This is a story from the Old Testament, a deuterocanonical source, and it's a secondary source from the book of Judges And it shows this Assyrian general getting his head cut off while he's drunk and sleeping in his stupor. And Gensler paints it with blood spattering everywhere, and the maid is sort of holding Holofernes' head while Judith slices through it with a dirk. And it's really macabre and gruesome. And so detailed, so full of realistic sort of visual attributes that it's amazing how it anticipates. Thank you so much, folks. It's amazing how it anticipates a later generation. It looks like something that is more realistic, certainly in a lot of artistic styles in later generations, including even the Romantic period, the Impressionists, and certainly when we get to the 20th century, we have the Expressionists and the Cubists. They're painting in a post-photography world. But this style of the Baroque period is so detailed that it seems to be as close as we can get. Why don't we look at that painting now? Because I think it will give us a great sense of how realistic this artistic style is and how detailed it is. Okay. Caravaggio, by the way, painted this same scene, and it's arguably just as famous. Okay, so there you have it. Now, the use of occlusion, shadows, to create this realistic quality is really remarkable. And when you compare it to Renaissance art, it marks a paradigm shift. So when you think of Baroque music, think of Holofernes getting his head sliced off. Well, maybe not. But think of detail. Think of ornament. Think of embellishment. Things really make the art jump off the proverbial canvas. And I say proverbially because we're going to be talking, of course, primarily about the organ. Now, we're going to be talking about the organ, so I'm going to bring up an organ video. This is an organist, a German organist by the name of Felix Hell. Now, that's not a typo. The man's last name is, in fact, Hell. H-E-L-L, as in the place of eternal damnation and suffering. But in German, of course, has a much nicer meaning. Hell in German simply means bright. So his name might as well be Felix Bright. Well, we're going to see him playing, and we're just going to watch a short clip here. And we're going to see some of those parallels between the visual arts and the music in this clip. Because what you're going to see is a tremendous level of detail and busyness in what the organist is playing. In fact, the organ itself is a kind of interesting instrument. I often tell people that I have never met an amateur organist. Now think about that for a minute. What does that mean? Well, it means that it would be very unusual to casually play the organ the way that one could say casually play the guitar. No offense, guitarists, but if you could play a G chord, a D chord, a B minor chord, and a C chord, you could start a band. Make a lot of money too, as many have demonstrated. But to really play the organ, well, that takes tremendous degree of dedication and time investment to master this instrument, because it requires the use not just of the hands, but also of the feet. Now you might say, well, Professor, don't pianists use their feet as well? Of course, there's a sustain pedal, there's a soft pedal, and so on. And that's true. However, that does not require a tremendous amount of coordination or tactile dexterity to use a sustain pedal. With an organ, you have a pedal board, and you have to play notes that correspond to pitches in the bass register, sometimes about 2.5 octaves worth of notes. And you have to move your feet in a sort of heel-toe configuration while wearing usually special footwear that enables you to pivot and manipulate the different pedals on the pedal board with great accuracy and efficiency. So Bach was himself an organist. And the organs of the Baroque period were famous. They were massive instruments. Many of them took years to build and had so many parts that it would make one's head spin to try to wrap our heads around how they built these things 300 years ago without the benefits and advantages conferred upon us by modern technology. Bach was not only an organ player, he was an expert on organs. And to be honest, it makes his early biographies and the early books that were written about him really boring. For example, there's a book, one of the early books written on Bach was called The Bach Reader by Hans T. David and Arthur Mendel. And it was basically a musicological endeavor to capture everything that we know about Bach. And it turns out that what early musicologists knew about Bach was that on this day, in March, he went to this church and he inspected this organ, and he found that the C in the fourth octave had a little bit of a schwach sound coming out of the 32-foot pipe, so he had to go adjust that. And the Rux positive on the left hand, on the middle manual. Now imagine that you're really excited to read about Bach, and this is what you get. Unfortunately, this is what we get because he lived so darn long ago. By Mozart's day, Mozart's keeping records of his actions. He's writing letters which were preserved for posterity's benefit. Beethoven, too. There's a tremendous treasure trove of personal items and Tagesbücher, the Tagesbücher, his daily books that he would write in when he was deaf and he wanted to convey information back and forth. So we know a whole lot about these people. We know very little, comparatively, an infinitesimal amount about Bach. So what we tend to focus on instead is music. So let's go ahead and look at this organ fugue in G major. And what I'd like you to pay attention to is the following. And this is really the critical thing about Bach and about this late Baroque style and about organ in particular. The style is characterized by heavy imitation. When we hear in one voice, and when we say voice here, we simply mean one independent musical line, we are going to hear in other voices. And when we hear them in other voices, they will be imitated in such a way so that when the second voice comes in, the first voice is already doing something else. In other words, every voice is going to play the same thing, but never at the same time. That was sort of the ultimate no-no of Bach's day. It would create what we call parallel octaves, which anyone who's taking music theory probably felt a chill up their spine when they hear it, because we're trained, inculcated in this mindset to avoid. And those of you who have taken music theory have no doubt, unless you're really perfect, you'll get your homework back at some point. You'll see the red, and you'll see P8 parallel octaves. Schlecht, furchtbar. We don't want it, sorry. So you'll never hear that at the same time. This has interesting implications, this idea of imitation, especially on an organ. Because we're going to hear a melody introduced, we call this a subject, a fugue subject, and then it's going to be imitated. And here's the critical thing. Whatever Bach introduces in the voice, he's going to imitate in another voice. And he doesn't care where that voice is sounding. It could be high, low, really low, in the middle register. He doesn't care. It's going to be identical. In fact, it has to be identical. Now, some of you see where this is going. No matter how ornamented, no matter how detailed and virtuosic the melody is, at some point, the organist is going to have to play that melody with their feet. There's no way around it. Because that's the nature of this contrapuntal style where every voice is of equal importance. So we'll listen to a little bit of this, and then we'll turn our attention to another fugue before we move on to the cantata. So this is, again, Felix Hell, or Felix Bright, as I like to call him. Into what we call the episodic material. So here's the organ. Actually, the organs come in many different shapes and sizes. Each keyboard is called a manual, from the Latin meaning of the hand. And of course, the pedal boards are there where the feet are. You'll also notice there seem to be tens, dozens, maybe more than 100 of these knobs on either side of the organist. And these knobs also have specific functions and a specific name. We call them stops. And this gives us an expression, by the way, when someone spares no expense and exerts every effort, we say that that person has pulled out all the stops. Well, if you were to go to a Baroque church and pull out all the stops on the organ, you really feel the building shake in some of these organs. So it was a way, each of these stops corresponds to a pipe. And so when you open them, you're essentially opening up all the pipes and therefore enabling maximum volume, dialing it up to 11, as it were. And that's something that you don't really do in Bach, and that would be more if you were playing Messiaen or something like that, what people call for that. Bach, by and large, did not indicate which stops he wanted his music played on. So organists have a lot of fun with that, coming up with how exactly to execute the performance of this music. Speaking of which, that brings us to Exhibit B. What does this music look like when it's notated? How on earth is a musician supposed to play this and read it? Well, those of us who have taken piano lessons, how many people here have taken piano lessons at some point? Fantastic. Many, I would venture to say, most of us, or at least more than half the people in this room, have had a piano lesson at some point. Now, many people, when they take piano, they come to that realization, hey, this is pretty hard. And often that realization happens because one realizes that in order to really play piano, one has to be able to independently manipulate both hands. Now, it's one thing if you're simply playing a chord in one hand and a melody in the other, as, for example, we encounter in the works of, Mozart. The left hand's not really doing much there, but with Bach, when we have independent motion, etc. You can hear that it's very different from Mozart, and this is just one example. If we were to really dial it up, we would have, very different from Mozart. Nothing compared to what we're about to hear on the organ. So the style of imitation, this added wrinkle of bringing in the feet. Now, those of us who have played piano, and even if you haven't, you can appreciate what it means to manipulate independent voices with your hands. Sometimes it gets very, very tricky, and that's just with playing with your hands. Now we're incorporating the feet into these views. So what does this look like? We're about to see, and this is one of Bach's most towering fugue compositions. This is known by musicians as the Great Fugue in G minor. And we call it the Great Fugue in G minor. Bach didn't call it that. Because BWV 578, which had been written a couple of decades earlier, is also in the key of G minor, but it's shorter. So guess what we call that one? Sure. The Little Fugue in G minor. Yeah. So, all right. Here is BWV 542, also known as the Great Fugue in G minor. So I'm going to go over here to the end of the Fantasia, and we'll see what this looks like as we get into the fugue. So it starts simply, because all fugues start with a sort of solitary statement of the subject. Fugues build in intensity. You start with one voice, then you gradually add voices until all of them are in. And typically for Bach, that means 4 voices. Gives us a wonderful window into the life of an organist. This is what organists have to learn when they want to gain a mastery of this repertoire. And of course, even you could be a great pianist, but that doesn't mean you can play organ. And we often use the analogy of squares and rectangles. A square qualifies and checks all the criteria to be a rectangle, but a rectangle is not a square. Similarly, organists, by definition, are pianists. But a pianist is not an organist. And it all comes down to the feet. Now, what does this look like when it's executed? We'll watch a short clip. Here's a rather eccentric figure by the name of Cameron Carpenter playing the same piece. And the fugue typically takes about 6 minutes or 6 minutes and change to get through. Carpenter gets through it in under 5. So he's playing almost, for those of you who have seen the movie Spaceballs, he's playing at what you might say is ludicrous speed. Should also be said, we're not in Kansas anymore. Should also be said that playing this music requires tremendous degree of stamina, which is not something that's often discussed when we talk about learning repertoire. We think that the major challenge is just learning the notes and getting the rhythms, but actually there's a tremendously taxing physical element to playing this music. Now this, you can see from the time step there, is nearly 5 minutes long, so he's got to keep up this sustained contrapuntal texture. This is not like Mozart. Mozart often gives you a break and he'll switch to a different, when I say texture, I mean different sort of interaction between the hands. But this is a constant stream of counterpoint. Counterpoint is a word you'll hear me use over the next 4 weeks, and it refers to note against note interaction. Let's go ahead and check out the end of this fugue, the last minute and a half or so. Again, I refer back to a statement I made earlier. There are very few casual amateur organists. This is not repertoire which is friendly towards amateurs. It's not like you can say, well, you know what, I'm going to just go into the church on this Monday morning. I'm just going to play a little bit of this Bach fugue, no big deal. I'm just kind of working on it. Not how it works with this music. It requires a tremendous degree of coordination, and often, this has just been my personal experience, the organists that I know are people who were trained as musicians from very young ages. You almost have to have parents who are musical, because otherwise, how on earth would the organ ever come across your radar? What 8-year-old comes home from school and says, Mom, I really want to play the organ. I really want to learn to play Bach fugues. Well, you get the point. All right, we're going to move on now, and we're going to talk about vocal music for the remainder of the program tonight. And we're going to talk about a genre, as I mentioned earlier, known as the cantata. You'll notice, by the way, that musicologists and I would say music nerds in general will often use shortcuts when searching for Bach repertoire. You just put in your number if you know the catalog number of the piece. As I said earlier, there are over 1,000 pieces in the Bach catalog, but they're organized not chronologically. They're organized by genres. So numbers 1 through roughly 215 are cantatas. And being that most of them are church works, they can tell us an awful lot about how Bach viewed the role of art in society. What was his purpose in writing art? And some of you who read the description on the website for tonight's lecture saw that it had those 3 letters, SDG, in the title of the program for tonight. Soli Deo Gloria. S is what that stands for. The Latin meaning, the glory of God alone. In other words, the purpose of this music, be it an organ fugue or be it a cantata, is to glorify the Lord, to intensify devotion, to bring the congregant closer to God. And that's it. It's not for money. It's not for fame or fortune. Bach was a man of very few indulgences, vices. He condemned the hedonistic lifestyle. He very likely would not have approved of this shirt, quite frankly. He was not only Lutheran, but a sexual Saxon Lutheran, someone who theologians from that period and now historians refer to the people who had that sort of mindset as pietist Lutherans. People who were extremely serious when it came to issues such as salvation, when it came to issues related to what we call eschatology, that is to say, the anticipation of the hereafter, that which describes or has to do with the kingdom of heaven. Bach was very serious about these things. And for us, it's very difficult in some way to relate to it. I often ask my students the question, how many of you woke up this morning and fretted for your soul? Thought to yourself, well, I better not sin today. I better strive to be virtuous today because I don't want to burn in a lake of fire. Well, very few, in fact, to this day, 0 hands have ever gone up. But it's a question that I am certain Bach entertained all the time. Where am I going when I shuffle off the mortal coil? They weren't interested. For Bach, he thought of the world, that is to say, life on earth, as a sort of hellish prison. And there are all sorts of cantatas which describe the low, corrupt, and debased human state. There's a chorale, Durch Adams Fall ist ganz verderbt. Verderbt is a great German word. Verderbt means something like corruption. Through the fall of Adam, man became completely corrupted. Ganz verderbt. There's another one, Cantata 179, Siehe zu, dass deine Gottesfurcht nicht Heuchelei sei. That's a mouthful. It means, see to it that your fear of the Lord is not hypocrisy, Heuchelei in German. There's cantatas with titles like Mein Herz schwimmt im Blut, number 199, My Heart Swims in Blood. There's Cantata 56, Ich will den Kreuzstab gerne tragen. I will gladly carry the cross. There's cantatas, some of them are happy. But most of them are like Cantata 12, which we may have time to discuss later in this lecture series, which has a wonderful German title, Weinen, Klagen, Sorgen, Sagen, which translates to something like weeping, lamenting, being extremely fretful, and being in a state of despair. And the chorus starts just everybody in these dissonant, overlapping notes, weinen, klagen, sorgen, sagen, weinen, klagen, with really tortured sounding harmonies. Wonderful, beautiful dissonances. That's not uncommon. One of my favorite Bach cantatas is number 106. It has a curious title in German. Gottes Zeit ist die allerbeste Zeit. For those of you who have been German, no means God's time is the very best of time. But what it means is, when you die, that's the best time. There's, your life on earth is, it is what it is. But when you die, that's really when life gets great. That's when your soul goes to heaven. And there's, quotations from the Psalms. There's this quote from Psalm 90, verse 2. Herr, lehre uns bedenken, dass wir sterben müssen, auch dass wir klug werden. Lord, teach that we must die. Once we understand this, we become so much smarter. We get the bass aria, bestelle dein Haus, denn du wirst sterben und nicht mehr lebendig sein. Get your house in order, because you're going to die. Und nicht lebendig sein, and you won't be alive anymore. I guess if you die, you're not alive anymore. All right, we're going to look at Cantata 131, which is a setting of Psalm 130. Again, just a coincidence with those numbers being so close. The catalog was put together in the 19th century by a guy by the name of Wolfgang Schmiede, nice Irish guy. Just joking. I don't know any Irish Schmiede. All right, so here's a cantata. It's in the key of G minor. We're going to watch two movements, and actually there's no break, so we'll watch straight through. The first one starts out with a slow fantasia-like movement, very slow. Count it like this. 1. Aus der Tiefe. Aus der Tiefe. From the depths, Lord, I cry to you. Aus der Tiefe rufe ich her zu dir. In Latin, this song, is very famous. De profundis clamavi Domine is the text in Latin. From the depths, Lord, I cry to you. Lass deine Ohren merken auf die Stimme meines Flehens. Let your ears mark the voice of my supplications. Now you know how to say supplications in German, by the way. It's Flehens. So if anybody asks you what you learned tonight, you say Flehens and supplication in German. All right, so we'll have this scrolling score. The recording is not my favorite one, but it's an old recording from the 1970s. Nikolaus Harnoncourt was the first conductor to record all of the Bach cantatas. It's a monumental achievement for any ensemble. So I've always had a kind of special place for Harnoncourt in my own listening because of the watershed nature of what he was able to accomplish with very little musicological references that we compared to what we have today. So you'll see the text scrolling, you'll see the notes here, of course, and again, you'll get a sense of simultaneity. Once the chorus is done intoning that opening, from the depths, Lord, I cry to you, from the depths, Lord, I cry to you, you're going to hear the music come to a sort of a moment of repose, and then we launch into a new tempo. Lord, let your ears mark the voice of my supplication, and here the voices will go into a 4-part fugue, with the altos leading, answered by the sopranos, then tenors and basses. So it has this sort of very fluid quality. And then the fugue goes into a bass solo. And the bass solo is on this text Lord, if you choose to hold us to account for our sins, who can stand before you? And it's this incredibly melismatic winding. Melismatic means lots of notes, one word. So the bass soloist has his work cut out for him. He's got to sort of wind his way through this solo while he's singing, if you choose to judge us, hold us to account for our sins, who can possibly stand before you? Who can stand? But with you, Lord, there's forgiveness. Then by dir ist die Vergebung. And while all this is happening, we've got an obligato oboe part, so the oboe solo, plus the basso continuo, which means all the other instruments. We're going to talk about that next week when we focus on instrumental music. And then, because it's not enough, Bach's about 20 years old, he's sort of flexing his chops a little bit. He's going to throw in a chorale in the upper voices, sung by the sopranos here. So it's just this incredible convergence of musical ideas, all happening at the same time, and somehow all fitting together. And that's really perhaps the great mystery that we're going to continue to unravel over the next 3 weeks after tonight. How does all this fit together? How on earth was this person able to envision these disparate musical elements and weave them together in this elegant tapestry? Let's listen to Cantata 131, just the opening 2 minutes, or 2 movements, I should say. It will be more than 2 minutes. So we'll have our instruments on the right, and here's our bass on the left. Again, Bach is about 20 years old when he writes this cantata, maybe closer to 21. Actually, Bach and I have the same birthday, so 299 years apart. Perhaps I was fated to write a dissertation. I imagine some of you may have a few questions about what you saw. So maybe what we'll do now is we'll get the lights. We'll take a couple of questions, and then I'll tell you what's on tap for next week. Ismael, start us off. Great question. Where do lyrics come from? Well, Bach did not write the lyrics, or very, very rarely did he write the lyrics. The lyrics came from typically whatever the gospel or epistle readings were for that particular Sunday. So a poet at court would arrange the text in such a way that Bach would set it to music. But it would usually have a message or narrative that was connected to that particular day on the liturgical calendar. So if you had an Easter cantata, like, for example, BWV 4, Christ lag in Todesbahnen, Christ lay in the bonds of death, you would have text that was appropriate for Easter. Same thing with the Christmas cantata, Pentecost, and so on and so forth, right down the line. Sometimes there wasn't a particular purpose, or I should say not purpose, but message for a particular Sunday on the calendar. Bach would he would usually get some kind of psalm text to work with. Because the Psalms, of course, are very expressive, especially what we call the penitential Psalms, such as 130, from the depths, Lord, I cry to you. That just calls out, pun intended, for an expressive musical setting. Yeah, well, Gerhard Philipp Telemann, another guy named Christoph Graupner. He was a big mocker back then, man. Nobody talks about him now, but he wrote a lot of music. I forget who 3 and 4 were, but yeah, Telemann was number 1. They wanted Telemann real bad. Telemann took a job in Hamburg, I believe, which of course was a bustling metropolitan city by 18th century standards, whereas Leipzig, as I mentioned earlier, kind of out in the sticks, if you will. Yes? So it's hard to say as with anybody, but glad you brought it up, because Bach is often, we describe him sometimes as the perfect storm of genetics and a really solid upbringing. So the genetics, a couple of things, and I'll talk more about this next week. Bach came from not just a musical family, but one of the preeminent musical families of central Germany. Christoph Wolff is a scholar who wrote one of the authoritative biographies on Bach in the early 21st century. It's called Bach, the Learned Musician. And in it, he traces back the family branches of the tree, the Bach family tree, back to the time before the 30 Years' War, to the late Renaissance. And you see everyone's a musician. This one's a town piper. This one's a fiddler. This one is a percussionist in a military ensemble. This one is an organist. This one's a singer. And it's very consistent. So a lot of musicians in the family. But as far as his upbringing, he had a very unusual childhood. His parents died within 6 months of each other when he was not yet 10 years old. So he went to live with his brother, whose name is Johann Christoph Bach, in Ohrdruf. And Johann Christoph was like I think 9 years older than him. So he's already working as an organist. So Bach had some music, and then he went to live with this brother, who was a professional musician, who, the legend goes, we know very little about Johann Christoph Bach, but the legend goes that he taught Bach how to play the organ. So both, perfect storm. Absolutely correct. A great observation. We're going to see that over and over again with Bach. He's not just going through the motions of setting the text. One gets that impression with other composers, by the way. Even Mozart. Listen to Mozart's recitatives and his operas, and you can chuck them out the window. There's nothing to write home about. It's like he can't wait to get to the next aria. He's not interested in the recitatives. For Bach, the recitatives are enormously important. We'll talk about that in week 3 when we look at St. Matthew Passion. So the religious convictions of Bach, where did it come from? That was instilled in him in a very profound way from his parents. In his upbringing, church was mandatory, and it was practically where the Bach family lived. Musicians in general had kind of a haven in churches. They were big employers of musicians, and if you were looking to get a job, and to get work to pay the bills, you could get a job in a church. So church was not only salvation and all that, devotion, worship, but it was also, practically speaking, what paid the bills for the Bach family. So he was someone who lived his whole life adhering to these very deep pietist Lutheran convictions. And we'll talk more about that when we get to week 3, and I talk about Lutheranism and the differences in doctrine between Lutheranism and Catholicism, and even Calvinism. We'll talk about that next week when we look at Bach's tenure in Cologne.
Yeah, just a point of information. Congregational Socratic Church in Westport just spent $500,000 for the new organ, head organ.
Wow.
From Germany.
Wow. Well, to quote the guy from the Shamrock commercials, I know the Germans build good stuff. So, yeah, that's awesome.
So
A great question. So in Bach's day, it was very difficult. You had to have access to a church organ loft. And moreover, you couldn't practice on your own. Because organs, like many musical instruments, require air. The thing is, you're not going to, blow into an organ to try to power it. I'm reminded of the scene in Robin Hood Men in Tights where Richard Lewis's character is in a medieval jacuzzi, and he has 6 guys around him blowing into the hot bathtub. To power, there was only one way to power an organ back then, and that was using bellows akin to what you find in a blacksmith's forge. So for Bach to practice, he'd have to bring someone along with him, and often that someone was one of his children. We often joke Bach had so many children so that he could ensure that someone was always available to pump the bellows while he practiced. Nowadays, and starting in the mid-20th century, they started building electric organs. In fact, Carpenter, we saw earlier, playing on Rogers model, an electric organ. So you can have organs in a smaller, more intimate space, although I would still contend that most people would probably not want them in their living rooms. They don't have that aesthetically pleasing quality to the eye that a piano has. And a piano, for many people, is like a piece of furniture that adds a certain level of panache, sophistication. But an organ doesn't have that quality. Yes, sir. Yes, that's right, he did. He collected all sorts of instruments, keyboard instruments. And Bach, when he died, he didn't have many items, objects in his will. In fact, his widow, Anna Magdalena, got next to nothing. Bach had accumulated very little during his life, but instruments, including a pedal harpsichord, so clavichords, violins, that was all he owned. So it's kind of a window into the life of a musician in the early 18th century. They were very much considered servants, and they accumulated very little in the way of worldly wealth. An exception to that rule would be Georg Friedrich Handel, who died with an estate worth something like $20 million adjusted for inflation. But again, he's writing music for the King of England, whereas Bach is writing, as we have said some 3 or 4 times, he's been writing music out of the provincial town of Leipzig. So he's not going to make a boatload of cash there. Well, what's on tap? One last question, then I'll tell you what's on tap. Sure, yeah. So some of you who read choral music are wondering what the heck's with these clefs? What are these notes? These are the clefs that Bach wrote music in. So the top one, canto, is what we now call soprano. That's the top voice, and it says soprano clef. Alto is the same. Tenore and basso are basically the same as tenor and bass. Fundamento is Italian for basso fundamento or basso continuo, which means the sort of the bass that is continuously playing, both giving us rhythm as well as harmony. And you can see as it goes on, you can see these numbers underneath it, which tell you what the chords are. We'll talk more about that next week. On the right, you have your standard Baroque instrumental consort, which would be an oboe violin. In this case, the unusual two violas, and the fagotto is the bassoon, so the bass wind instrument, if you will. And these are sort of ubiquitous in Baroque ensembles. And they change. The Baroque ensembles will change movement to movement, even in the same piece. So next week, we're going to turn to a very interesting part of Bach's career. He is about 32 when he realizes that he's got to leave his current job in the city of Weimar, and he's got to seek employment elsewhere. Weimar was a great place for him as a young, up-and-coming musician, but now he's got young kids, he's got to worry about their education, he's got to find a place to sort of move as his family is growing and as his responsibilities are growing, and he's not experiencing an increase in salary. So he's very frustrated in Weimar. He moves to the town of Untitled Chapter, where he becomes an employee of Prince Leopold of Cologne, who was an avid flourished musician and someone who really appreciated Bach's gifts. During this period, while he's living in a Calvinist court, he's not writing cantatas. He's not writing his usual primary style of music, which is sacred liturgical music. He's now writing instrumental music. So we're going to turn our gaze to instrumental books primarily next week, including a collection of 6 concerti featuring very unusual and novel combinations of soloists, and we call this collection the Brandenburg Concerti, after its dedicatee, Christian Margaret of Brandenburg. So I hope to see everybody next Tuesday